Picture this. In a dimly lit room in a French palace, three men sit around a mahogany table, quill pens, scratching across parchment. The year is 1700, and they're dividing up an entire empire, like pieces on a chessboard. What they don't realize is that their secret agreement will unleash a war that will rage across Europe for 13 bloody years. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about the most consequential secret deal in European history, one that most people have never heard of, yet it reshaped the entire continent forever. This is the story of how backroom politics, family dynasties, and broken promises ignited a conflict that would determine the fate of nations for centuries to come. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss the shocking revelations ahead. Now, let's uncover the truth about the War of the Spanish Succession. The stage was set in 1700 with the death of Charles II of Spain. Here was a man so physically and mentally impaired by centuries of Habsburg inbreeding that he couldn't even chew his food properly. Yet this pathetic figure held the key to the most powerful empire on earth. Spain in 1700 wasn't just another European kingdom, it was a global superpower that made today's superpowers look small by comparison. Spanish territories stretched from the Americas to Europe, from the Philippines to North Africa. Whoever controlled Spain would control world trade, unlimited wealth, and unprecedented power. Charles II had no children, no brothers, no direct heirs. His death would trigger the greatest succession crisis Europe had ever seen, and every major power knew it. The question wasn't if war would come, it was who would be left standing when the smoke cleared. Enter the secret dealmakers, Louis XIV of France, the Sun King himself, and William III of England. These weren't just kings, they were master manipulators who understood that the fate of Europe hung in the balance. In 1698, they signed the First Partition Treaty, carving up the Spanish Empire like a Thanksgiving turkey. But here's where it gets interesting. They did this while Charles II was still alive. Imagine the audacity, to foreign kings secretly deciding who gets what from your empire while you're still breathing. The arrogance is staggering, and it would come back to haunt them in ways they never imagined. The treaty seemed reasonable on paper. The main Spanish territories would go to Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria, a neutral choice that wouldn't upset the balance of power. France would get some Italian territories, while Austria would receive others. Everyone wins, right? Wrong. Joseph Ferdinand died in 1699, just months after the treaty was signed. Suddenly, their carefully crafted plan lay in ruins. Back to the drawing board, Louis and William crafted the Second Partition Treaty in 1700. This time, Archduke Charles of Austria would get Spain and the colonies, while France would receive a larger share of Italian territories. They thought they had it all figured out. But they made one critical mistake. They never asked Charles II what he wanted. And what he wanted would shatter their secret agreements and plunge Europe into chaos. On his deathbed, Charles II did something that shocked everyone. Instead of accepting the partition of his empire, he left everything, every single territory, to Philip of Anjou, Louis XIV's grandson. With his dying breath, he essentially handed the entire Spanish Empire to France. Think about what this meant. If Philip became king of both France and Spain, these two nations would control most of Europe and the Americas. The balance of power that had kept European politics stable for decades would collapse overnight. This wasn't just about royal succession anymore. This was about the survival of other European nations. Louis XIV faced an impossible choice. Accept the partition treaty he had secretly negotiated, or accept his grandson's inheritance and risk the wrath of all Europe. Being Louis XIV, the man who declared "I am the state," he chose power over peace. He accepted the Spanish inheritance for Philip, knowing full well it meant war. When news of Charles II's will reached European capitals, the reaction was swift and furious. Emperor Leopold I of Austria was outraged. The throne should have gone to his son, Archduke Charles. The English Parliament was terrified of French dominance. The Dutch Republic saw their trade routes threatened. Even Portugal and Savoy, usually neutral, joined the growing anti-French coalition. But here's what makes this conflict truly fascinating. It wasn't just about who sat on the Spanish throne. This was the world's first truly global war. While European armies clashed in Flanders and Italy, English and French colonists fought in North America. Spanish galleons loaded with American silver became prizes for English privateers. The war raged across 4 continents simultaneously. The human cost was staggering. Conservative estimates put the death toll at over 400,000 military casualties. But when you include civilian deaths from disease, famine, and displacement, the number easily exceeds 1 million. Entire regions were depopulated. Cities were burned to ash. Families were torn apart by a conflict that began with secret negotiations in palace rooms. Let me share with you the story of Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. Her husband John was England's greatest military commander, leading the coalition forces to victory after victory against the French. But Sarah's real power came from her friendship with Queen Anne of England. These two women, meeting privately in royal chambers, made decisions that affected the fate of millions. Sarah once wrote to Queen Anne, "Your Majesty must understand that this war is not about Spanish succession. It is about whether England will remain free or become a vassal to French ambition." These weren't just words. They represented the fears of an entire nation watching French power grow unchecked. The turning point came at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. The Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy led a daring march deep into Bavaria, catching the French and Bavarian armies completely by surprise. In a single afternoon, they shattered the myth of French invincibility that had dominated European warfare for 50 years. But here's what the history books don't tell you. Blenheim was won through intelligence gathering that bordered on espionage. Marlborough's spies had infiltrated French military headquarters, providing detailed information about troop movements and battle plans. This wasn't just military genius, it was early modern intelligence warfare. The aftermath of Blenheim sent shockwaves through Europe. Louis XIV, the Sun King who had never known defeat, suddenly found his armies in full retreat. French morale collapsed. The coalition sensed victory was within their grasp. But the war was far from over, and the most surprising twists were yet to come. As the war dragged on, something unexpected happened. War fatigue set in across Europe. The English people, initially enthusiastic about checking French power, began questioning why their sons were dying in foreign fields. The Dutch, bearing enormous financial burdens, started looking for a way out. Even the Austrians, who stood to gain the Spanish throne, began to waver. This is where the story takes its most dramatic turn. In 1711, Emperor Joseph I of Austria died suddenly, leaving his brother Charles as the sole Habsburg heir. Suddenly, Charles wasn't just claiming the Spanish throne. He was now Holy Roman Emperor. If he became King of Spain too, the Habsburg dominance that the war was meant to prevent would simply replace French dominance. The irony was almost too perfect. The English and Dutch had spent a decade fighting to prevent one power from becoming too dominant, only to realize they might be creating an even more dangerous Habsburg superpower. Secret negotiations began almost immediately. Queen Anne's government, led by Robert Harley, secretly opened peace talks with France in 1711. These weren't public diplomatic conferences. These were clandestine meetings in London townhouses and Parisian salons. The same kind of secret deal-making that had started the war was now being used to end it. The most shocking secret of all was that England negotiated its own separate commercial agreement with Spain, cutting out their Dutch allies entirely. Remember, these were supposed to be coalition partners fighting for shared principles. But when it came to securing exclusive trading rights in Spanish America, worth millions in today's money, alliance loyalty went out the window. When the Dutch discovered this betrayal, it nearly shattered the coalition completely. Years of shared sacrifice, common struggle, and mutual support were thrown away for commercial advantage. This wasn't just about ending the war anymore. It was about who would dominate global trade in the coming century. The Peace of Utrecht, signed between 1713 and 1715, reshaped the map of Europe more dramatically than any event. Since the fall of Rome, the war involved three contenders for the vacant throne of Spain, and had involved much of Europe for over a decade. But the final settlement bore little resemblance to the secret partition treaties that had started the whole conflict. Philip V remained King of Spain, but renounced any claim to the French throne forever. This was supposed to prevent the union of the two crowns, but in reality, Spain became a French satellite state for the next century. Austria received the Spanish, Netherlands, Naples, Milan, and Sardinia, compensation for losing Spain itself. England gained Gibraltar, Minorca, and exclusive trading rights in Spanish America. But here's the most important outcome that nobody talks about. Britain emerged as the dominant global power. The treaties that ended the war marked the rise of the power of Britain and the British colonial empire. The Royal Navy, strengthened by years of war, now ruled the seas unchallenged. British merchants gained access to markets that had been closed for centuries. The foundation of the British Empire was laid in the secret negotiations that ended this forgotten war. The human consequences were equally profound. Hundreds of thousands of Catalans who had supported the Austrian claim faced persecution under the new Bourbon regime. Their language was banned, their institutions abolished, their culture suppressed. The autonomous regions of Spain lost freedoms they had enjoyed for centuries, all because of decisions made in distant capitals by rulers who had never set foot in Catalonia. In the German state, the war left deep scars that would influence European politics for generations. Bavaria, which had allied with France, was occupied and humiliated. The smaller German princes learned that their survival depended not on principle but on choosing the winning side. This opportunistic mindset would characterize German politics well into the modern era. What makes this story even more remarkable is how quickly Europe forgot the lessons of the War of Spanish Succession. Within 30 years, the same patterns of secret diplomacy, dynastic ambition, and balance of power politics would lead to new conflicts. The War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, All followed similar patterns of backroom dealing, followed by continental warfare, but the immediate impact was transformational. France, exhausted by war and debt, never again threatened to dominate Europe through military conquest alone. The Habsburg Empire, denied Spain but strengthened in Central Europe, began its long evolution into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Britain started its rise to global supremacy, and Spain, once the world's greatest power, began its long decline into irrelevance. The most fascinating aspect of this entire story is how modern it feels. Secret diplomatic negotiations, intelligence gathering, propaganda wars, commercial competition disguised as political principle. These could be headlines from today's news. The tools have changed, but the fundamental patterns of international relations established during the War of Spanish Succession still shape our world today. Consider the parallels to contemporary geopolitics. Just as European powers worried about French hegemony in 1700, modern nations grapple with rising powers that threaten established balances. The secret partition treaties of 1698 and 1700 echo in modern spheres of influence negotiations. The commercial motivations behind the Peace of Utrecht mirror today's trade wars and economic sanctions. The role of intelligence and information warfare is particularly striking. Marlborough spy networks provided strategic advantages that determined the outcome of major battles. Similarly, the propaganda efforts of all sides, French claims of legitimacy, English appeals to balance of power, Austrian assertions of rightful inheritance, shaped public opinion and political support in ways that feel remarkably contemporary. Even the economic dimensions of the conflict resonate today. The war was ultimately about controlling global trade routes, colonial markets, and commercial opportunities. When English negotiators secretly pursued exclusive trading rights in Spanish America, they were engaging in the same kind of economic nationalism that dominates international relations in the 21st century. Perhaps most importantly, the War of Spanish Succession demonstrated how rapidly the international order can shift. In 1700, Spain was still considered the world's dominant power. By 1715, it had become a second-rate nation dependent on French support. France, which had seemed unstoppable under Louis XIV, found itself exhausted and financially ruined. Britain, previously a marginal player in European affairs, had become the dominant global force. These dramatic reversals happened in just 15 years, lightning speed in historical terms. They remind us that current international hierarchies, no matter how stable they appear, can be overturned by unforeseen events and strategic miscalculations. The secret agreements that seemed so clever in 1700 unleashed forces that their architects could never have anticipated. The legacy of these events extends far beyond European politics. The British commercial advantages gained at Utrecht laid the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution. Control of Spanish-American trade routes provided capital that funded technological innovation and manufacturing development. The global economy that emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries was built on the foundation of treaties signed in Dutch meeting rooms 3 centuries ago. So what can we learn from this remarkable story? First, that secret diplomacy often produces unintended consequences that dwarf the original objectives. The partition treaties were meant to prevent a major war. Instead, they caused the most destructive conflict Europe had seen in centuries. Modern policymakers would do well to remember this lesson when crafting their own backroom deals. Second, that the balance of power is more fragile than it appears. The European equilibrium that had maintained relative peace for decades collapsed almost overnight when Charles II's will upset carefully laid plans. Today's international system, built on institutions and agreements that seem permanent, could prove equally vulnerable to unexpected shocks. Third, that commercial and economic motivations often drive political and military conflicts more than ideological or dynastic considerations. The War of Spanish Succession was ultimately about trade routes, colonial markets, and commercial opportunities. The high-minded rhetoric about legitimate succession and balance of power masked more fundamental economic competition. Finally, that individual decisions by political leaders can have consequences that last for centuries. Louis XIV's choice to accept the Spanish inheritance for his grandson shaped European history for the next 300 years. Charles II's decision to leave his entire empire to Philip of Anjou triggered changes that still influence global politics today. The secret conflict that changed Europe forever wasn't really secret at all. It was hidden in plain sight, documented in treaties and diplomatic correspondence that historians have studied for generations. But the story has been forgotten, because it doesn't fit our neat narratives about progress, democracy, and human rights. Instead, it reveals the messy, opportunistic, and often accidental nature of historical change. This story challenges us to look beyond the official versions of history to understand the real forces that shape our world. The next time you hear about diplomatic negotiations or international agreements, remember the partition treaties of 1700. Ask yourself, what unintended consequences might follow? What interests are really at stake? How might future generations judge the decisions being made today? The men who met in secret to divide the Spanish Empire thought they were preventing a war. Instead, they unleashed forces that transformed the global order. Their story reminds us that history is not a series of inevitable developments, but a chain of choices. Some wise, some foolish, all consequential. As we face our own international challenges, we would do well to remember the lessons of the War of Spanish Succession. Secret agreements have a way of becoming public disasters. Balance of power calculations can backfire spectacularly, and the pursuit of narrow national interests often produces outcomes that serve no one's interests at all. What do you think about these parallels between 18th century European politics and today's international relations? Do you see similarities between the secret partition treaties and modern diplomatic negotiations? Have we learned the lessons of the War of Spanish Succession, or are we doomed to repeat the same patterns of miscalculation and unintended consequences? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one and love hearing your perspectives on these fascinating historical parallels. And if you enjoyed uncovering this hidden chapter of European history, make sure you're subscribed to the channel because we've got more incredible stories of secret conflicts, hidden agreements, and forgotten wars that shaped the modern world. Until next time, keep questioning the official narrative, and remember, the most important history is often the history they don't teach you in school. Tell us which country or city you're watching from. See you in the next video. Bye.